Right then. Okay, everybody. Well, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's first session, which is going to be focusing on inclusive economics education. So getting started, the sharp-eyed amongst you may have noticed that I'm not, in fact, Stefania Paredes Fuentes. I thought I might pretend to be her, but I think some of you have met her already, and I think that would basically ruin my cover completely. So my name is Tim Burnet, and I work at Aston University in the UK. And I'm a co-author of Stefania's on several of her publications relating to diversity and inclusion in economics. Fortunately, given that I'm not quite the headline act you're expecting, fortunately today is not actually about me. It's about our three fantastic presenters, where we have Sergio Barrera of Virginia Tech, talking about transplanting successful approaches from STEM subjects to improve inclusivity in economics. We've got Daniela Tavasci from Queen Mary in London, who's going to be talking about awarding gaps. And finally, we've got Aselia Urmanbetova from Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, who's presenting some joint work with insights from outreach and engagement activities in Atlanta. So before we get into that, though, I just thought it would be kind of worth just reflecting for a moment on the sort of the implications of the talks that we're about to hear. So we hear a lot about diversity in economics, probably because diversity is measurable, right? You can measure the different types of students within an institution. But inclusion's a much trickier concept, but it's tricky, but it's a vital counterpart to diversity. So inclusion involves ideas like mutual respect, equal opportunities, and equal voice. Inclusivity promotes belongingness amongst students and staff, and crucially, inclusion creates sustainable diversity, where all individuals feel like they belong. So actually, we can keep diversity. Inclusivity is not kind of token schemes where you can fiddle with your entrance or basically who you let into your university each year. Who basically, you know, if you can, everyone knows that university can tinker with who they admit. Admit a whole bunch of people from non-conventional backgrounds who feel thoroughly alienated on arrival. Inclusivity aims to avoid that. And the point with inclusion is that it needs change in order to actually work. It needs behavioral change, it needs cultural change. Sometimes it needs curriculum change. And crucially, change doesn't take place naturally. Systems resist change, especially where the group in power in a system has enjoyed that power, has enjoyed the fact that other people are excluded from the conversation. So that's why these talks are really important, because we're going to learn about different manifestations of change in institutions. So without further ado, let's get into these into our talks. So each speaker is going to have 15 minutes. I've spoken to the speakers, and we'll give them all a 2-minute warning before the end of their talk. If you have any questions, please place them in the chat. I have a chat chair in Ramin who's going to be monitoring the chat and communicating the questions. If you like particular questions, I think you can upvote them. Is that right, Ramin? Can people upvote questions? Okay, perfect. Yeah. I'd say in thing. So, and then once we've been through all our talks, we'll pause and go through these questions and ask the various members. So if you're asking a question, do indicate who it's being asked to. And finally, just to remind people before someone has a heart attack. And this session is being recorded, just so you know. So unless anybody has any problems, Sergio, you are good to share your screen and commence your talk.
All right, can everybody hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first, I want to apologize for the name change. We were trying to figure out what was catchy and what stuck, and this is what we decided on. Title of the talk might change again. This is a working paper that me, Marion at Home, Sarah Jacobson, and Susan Sajati are working on. And it's called Making an Economics Identity Worth Adopting for Diverse Students, What We Can Learn from STEM Education. So before I start getting into the meat of my presentation, I just want us to think of a few questions, right? I want you to think about these questions from the perspective of our students. So the first question is, what do economists look like? So just think about first introductory classroom, maybe even an economics major. What do we think our students think of when they think of what an economist looks like? And so my second question related, is this the picture that we send of what an economist looks like? And there's nothing wrong with these economists. These are all great economists, right? But I just want us to keep this question in mind. And here's two other questions and sub-questions that I think are important. Second one is, what topics do economists believe are important? And again, I want you to think from a student's perspective. What are we telling our students? What topics we think are important? And then related to that is, what are acceptable answers related to those topics? And then the third question, what skills does a good economist have? And a related question is, can these skills be developed over time? Could they even be developed in the short amount of time that we have them in our classrooms? All right. So here's our motivation. This shouldn't be really anything new to people who follow diversity in economics, but our motivation is that economics has a diversity problem. This is true globally and even more so in the US. And I'm going to apologize if this conversation is a little bit US centric, but I think some of this applies to an international context too. But globally, women comprise 37% of junior faculty, but only 25% of senior faculty. And these statistics are even worse if you look at the United States. And if we take a look at the universe of all PhDs awarded between 2010 and 2018 to US-born students, only 14% of these went to first-generation students, meaning students who are the first in their families to get a bachelor's degree. And this is compared to 26% for all PhDs. And then when we look at minorities, in the US, Black, Hispanic Americans, American Indians, they comprise about 32% of the US population, but they only earned about 17.7% of economics degrees. And this includes PhDs and bachelor's degrees. If we look at PhDs, these statistics are even worse. And what we want to argue is that diversifying the field is important, not just for equity reasons, but also efficiency reasons. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that we lose credibility if we don't reflect the rest of society, whether that's society within our own countries or society abroad, right? And I also want to argue that diverse backgrounds and experience, they allow for better research and policy because they allow people to see issues from a different perspective that other people otherwise might miss. And so we merge some economic theory with the way that we try to evaluate this problem, right? So what we want to do in this project is we want to consider major choice through the identity economics framework of Akerlof and Cranton. And this is an old paper, about 20 years old. But essentially what this theory says is that people's identity, it mediates the utility they get from economic choices like major choice. And people get utility from conformance and disutility from divergence from social norms, archetypes, and expectations related to their social categories. And these social categories can include everything from race, gender, class, sexual orientation, whatever social category it is. And so what we argue is that in the economics classroom, we set the norms and archetypes through what we do in the classroom, whether that's through our teaching, through the examples that we use, how we treat students, the types of assignments we assign, and how we grade things. And most importantly, we signal what kind of people are successful as economists and whose interests and concerns matter in economics. So using this identity economics framework, if a student diverges from this, then they're going to get disutility from studying economics, and they're going to be less likely to study economics. Right? And the positive thing is that, there is some hope. STEM faced similar problems in the past, but they have better representation by gender, first gen, and URM students. And some of the concepts that inclusive STEM education uses map pretty well to this identity economics framework, right? So we introduced the concept of identity economics framework just to, identify this is economics, right? This is something that we can understand as economists, and we can use these concepts from STEM education, right? So one of the things inclusive STEM likes to talk about a lot is identity formation. And what they mean by this is the type of person that students aspire to be and choose to live out in the present. And this involves how students believe a person like them will fit in and be valued in STEM. And so interventions that try to target this identity formation, they usually try to help students from diverse backgrounds see themselves in STEM. And that includes highlighting the work of diverse STEM scientists, highlighting diverse STEM topics, stuff that people believe will resonate more with students from diverse backgrounds, even establishing peer and mentorship groups. A second concept that we think is important is called asset-based learning. And this views every student as possessing unique and valuable assets that can support their own, but also their classmates' learning and success. And what's key about this framework is that it views different skills as complementary to learning. And this is as opposed to a deficit approach that focuses on the lack of skills that students have or the lack of preparation that they have for the course. And if we think about an asset-based learning approach, that's really just a diversity of curriculum that's allowing students with different skill sets to be successful and to help other people learn. And in self-efficacy, this is a student's belief in their abilities, and this allows them to persevere when challenged. And this is related to the other two concepts. But this also involves whether a student believes they can improve and learn material being taught. So now when we think about diverse students, right, we have to think about their demographics, the type of interest that they have, and also the education background that they have. And some of these things might be different than our conventional students that are overrepresented in the field. And that's why we think we have to take efforts to try to validate these differences. And here's some small evidence that identities are important, right? So women and URM students at a US liberal arts institution studying economics reported being less likely to report professors used relevant examples in class, and they were more likely to believe that professors overlooked important aspects of issues being studied. They were also more likely to feel different from typical economic students and less likely to believe that they themselves can be economists. And they were also less likely to feel that they could learn the material. And additionally, right, if we think about more than just, the social categories, the race, gender, identification, if we think about the abilities too, right, it's been shown that inculcating a growth mindset in students increases students' performance, their enjoyment, and their continued enrollment in courses. And not surprisingly, STEM fields that believe ability is more fixed, they have bigger racial achievement gaps. And economics is one of those fields where faculty are more likely to believe that ability is fixed. Okay. So now I go back to the questions, right? What do economists look like? In our classroom, do we send a message that this is what economists look like? And again, there's nothing wrong with these economists. These are all great economists, all do important work. But can we also send a message that this is what economists look like? And in thinking about the topics that economists study, what topics do economists find important? Well, here's what students find important. And this is a word cloud of what students find important at Williams College. Bigger word obviously means that more students find this important, right? And many of us incorporate these topics in our courses. But I think it's always useful to ask, can we find ways to further incorporate these interests in our courses? And then even thinking about, topics that we like to cover ourselves, topics like international trade, immigration, human capital formation, taxes, subsidies, and transfers, positive and negative externalities. We should ask ourselves, does our presentation of these concepts and their implications affect the utility that students from diverse backgrounds receive from studying economics? And I'll just give you an example, right? We may not present these topics in a way that resonate with diverse students. So let's think about excessive focus on gains from trade. If we talk about trade and then the conclusion that we try to teach is there's gains from trade and therefore trade is worth adopting. Well, how does this resonate for students from communities negatively impacted by trade? Or if we talk about inequality and our first explanation is it's due to human capital differences, how does this resonate for students from working class backgrounds? Do we implicitly send a message that their parents are less able than their more affluent peers? Or if we talk about immigration decreasing wages, how does this resonate with students from immigrant communities who might hear very harsh rhetoric in line with this point? Or my final example, deadweight loss from subsidies. How do students who receive financial aid resonate with this? Are they going to feel like they're part of a deadweight loss? Right? And we know, being practitioners, that current research on these topics is very nuanced. It's very nuanced. And we can allow students to actually share their experiences and opinions that even question the introductory models that we teach. And I think this can promote further interest, right? This can allow people to continue studying and to find that their viewpoints actually do have a voice in the field. We just have to be willing to engage these conversations, right? So these two topics, what topics do economists find important? What do economists look like? This is the identity formation of what we can learn from STEM, right? Final question, what skills do economists have? This here is related to the asset-based learning and the self-efficacy part. So first question, does our syllabus look like this, right? Where pretty much most of the grade is based on exams, right? And there's a million reasons why we might do this. So I'm not implying any judgment here on that. There might be institutional constraints, there might be time constraints, but I think it's important to keep in mind what skills are we telling our students are important for economists to have if our syllabus looks like this. And this involves more than weights placed on exams, right? Does our coursework test other skills important for economists? Things like creative thinking, teamwork, asking new questions, or even communicating research findings. And then if students do lack any of the skills that we're grading for, do we provide feedback to students to help them correct any mistakes? And do we give our students the resources and encouragement that they need to grow? So this here is where I think an asset-based approach, validating different skills, acknowledging different skills, testing different skills, and providing timely feedback can build more self-efficacy to increase student utility.
Sergio, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. So here's just a couple solutions, right? So the bottom is a slide from my economics of race class. Before I start talking about how the past can influence racial and ethnic inequality, I highlight the work of a prominent Black economist, right? And I talk about who she is, what she's done, and what she's studied, and then explicitly tie in my lecture into her work. And then the above is an email from my co-author, Sarah. And here you can see that she was in touch enough with her students to know that they were struggling in the beginning and doubting their ability in econ. But over the course, she offered them encouragement to continue progressing. And there's evidence that solutions like this actually work, right? So just a welcome email demonstrating diverse economists and diverse research topics and increased student performance in economics courses by 3 percentage points. And I think this was at 9 different universities. And then another study showed that emails detailing performance and offering ways to succeed and encouragement to succeed increased URM performance in courses, including economics, but ranging across the field, increased student performance by 11.2 percentage points in the course, and increased college persistence by 5 percentage points, even 7 semesters later. And then also incorporating active learning techniques like peer instruction and providing rapid and timely feedback, this nearly doubled the increase in comprehensive macroeconomics exam scores when students were tested before and after the course, right? And so we argue that these interventions work because they allow students to feel their identity is more in line with economics, they're capable of succeeding in economics, and their skills, experiences, and presence are valued in economics. And so in that way, we believe other interventions, peer networks, mentoring, diversifying examples used in class that are built on these principles, they can increase underrepresented student success and persistence in further study. And that's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You just muted Tim.
Tim, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm an idiot. I was going to say thank you very much, Sergio. So some really interesting insights there. Crucially, if anybody would like to ask Sergio any questions at the end, if you can just put it in the chat, and Ramin will collect those, and we'll go through those after all 3 talks. So, but in the meantime, without further ado, Daniela, are you okay to share your slides looking at awarding gaps at Queen Mary University in London?
Thank you, Tim. Are we all okay? Can you hear me? Can you see my slides?
Yes,
good.
yes, and yes.
So it's 15:25. So 15:40, I will have to be done. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Sergio, thank you so much for your presentation. I simply loved it. Thank you. So this is a preliminary study on the awarding gaps across ethnicity and gender in the School of Economics and Finance at Queen Mary University of London. We just explored some of the hypotheses we had in mind. After all, these are our students, so we are supposed to know them. And we are working harder on the very same topic. So the idea came from a well-known report in 2021, reporting ethnicity and awarding gaps, where the tails of the distributions were interesting in terms of different ethnic groups. It is well known that as the BAME community is aggregated, the distribution might look like there is no awarding gap. But when you actually looked at both the tails of the distribution and disaggregate the components of the BAME, surprise, you do have an ethnic awarding gap. Being economist and talking about awarding gap, you can't escape gender. So we also looked into the gender dimension of the awarding gap, and we were also curious to try and understand whether gender was different within each individual ethnic groups. So the BAME groups is well documented as to be ineffective. For Queen Mary University of London, this was particularly challenging because at the same time the university was developing a dashboard for the awarding gap, claiming that there was no awarding gap based essentially on the grouping. So when we decided to carry out this study, we're essentially trying to target this institutional posture of passing the message that Queen Mary, as the most inclusive university of its kind, did not have an awarding gap. So I'm just saying that to share with you the difficulties that we may have found in carrying out this. So we found differences in awarding gaps exist between ethnic groups, specifically as the literature had pointed towards. The most significant gap within economics seems to be between white and Black students. So, and again, we have an issue here. There is also differences within broad ethnic groups, which obviously undermine the credibility of the BAME grouping. So Bangladeshi students tend, for example, to have worse than Pakistani, worse than Indians. So the students' demographics in terms of ethnicity for this particular cohort that we worked on was 768 students, 41% female and 59% male. Queen Mary is well known to have an above average presence of female students. 71% were BAME and 21% were white. So again, we have a high percentage of specific demographic groups. We broke down by years of study and found that the BAME group is actually diversified. So the analysis of distribution tails does provide further insight, as the report from Advanced Higher Education 2021 had suggested. The white group tends to occupy the entire distribution from tail to tail. The extreme of the distribution see a higher concentration of BAME students, but different. So the highest part, we tend to have Arabs and Asians, excluding Chinese, while on the bottom side, we have stronger concentration of Black and Africans. In terms of gender, we had relatively poor data availability in this preliminary study within groups. So we decided not to break down by years. In some ethnic groups, we have a 50-50 proportion in the average first class mark. In the top part of the distribution, males outperformed females in the two largest groups that we have. Females, however, tend to perform better in the smaller ethnic groups. In the bottom part of the distribution, there is a higher presence of female. Now, obviously, this is just analytics. First question is, what is this due to? And we then decided to have a different approach and to see whether the role of assessment strategy and module type had anything affecting these outcomes. So we decided to investigate module type and assessment strategy. I'm going to explain briefly in a minute what we mean. So module type will be subject specific. So we decided within economics, at least in our experience at Queen Mary, but I think this might resonate with you, is the quants versus non-quants modules. Okay, so what happens in modules which use a good proportion of quantitative modules versus modules where there are other skills involved, like writing skills. So essentially, what happens between econometrics 2 versus history of economic thought, just to make an example, okay? This obviously is subject specific, but we had in mind replicability for other subjects. So subject specific for us may be quant versus non-quant. For other subjects, they may be business versus marketing. I'm just making it up, okay? The other variable that we consider is the assessment strategy. And again, we considered a binary situation where the assessment is diversified versus where it's not diversified. The idea came because there's been a long-standing debate within our department, with part of us trying to convince the other side to diversify the assessment in order to provide better and wider opportunities to our students to be able to demonstrate their asset, to say that with Sergio's words. So these are our results. So we can see that for non-quantitative modules, the Black students tend to perform worse than other groups, and the Indian tending to perform best, with some comparability between the other ones. Here we have the quant. Now it's sensibly worse, the performance of the Black student versus the Indian and the other students. We now have the diversified assessment, and again, the Black students tend to perform worse, but not so much, with the Black students Black students across the various dimensions performing systematically worse than other. And sorry, I've got other participants trying to come in the middle of my screen, Zoom, non-Zoom users. And again, Indian students performing better across the entire spectrum, non-quant versus quant, traditional versus non-traditional. And so is Pakistani students, while the Bangladeshi students tend to perform, again, worse than the Indian students. So this looks like the grouping, again, is very misleading, and we will have to look inside each component of the BAME and on top of the tails of the distributions. So white students tend to perform across the board on average. So these are some statistics about the impact of quants versus non-quants modules. And we can see that quants modules are attended by 641 students for that year. And we have a 9 percentage point awarding gap, while the non-quants modules are attended by 704 students. So clearly, there is some selection bias. Some students tend to perceive the awarding gap and to choose modules which are non-quants. But still, we have 2 percentage positive gap here. 698 students attended traditional modules, meaning non-diversified, and here we have a 3 percentage point gap. The modules with diversified assessment are attended by 676 students, and here we have a very, very small awarding gap. So in conclusion, there is clear policy prescription for diversifying assessment strategies. But there is also an issue of communicating the awarding gap. I've been talking to our colleagues, and there is very little knowledge about how much their module contributes to the overall awarding gap of our students. So it's very important to workshop these findings. At the moment, our institutional data we managed to convince Queen Mary to disaggregate the BAME, but we still don't have the granularity at module level and assessment level, and we are clearly pushing for it. We are pushing for more training and CPD in all possible venues, including the postgraduate certificate in academic practice and workshops. We are also trying to implement more processes that lead to inclusive practices, so co-creation, peer assessment and feedback, group works, learning reflection. We are then trying also to combine awarding gap analytics with inclusive teaching practices. And as I said repeatedly, we're trying to convince Queen Mary to have a data collection approach that reflects the issues at stake. It's obviously essential to find further evidence across various disciplines, but the main problem that we seem to have is also data collection. So we have done a monumental job thanks to the British Academy. We won an award to use some brilliant research assistants amongst our PhD students to combine two data sets. So on the one hand, we have the data sets of the enrollment statistics with all the demographics of our students. On the other hand, we have essentially the data coming out of the examination board. And so we have to put this together. So on top of that, we have to go and see every individual piece of assessment and combine them. And at the same time, categorize the various models, quants versus non-quants. We are at the moment working on a 5-year database. So stay tuned for further, more robust findings. And this is it from me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Daniela. So some really thought-provoking stuff there, which kind of links into what Sergio was talking about, potentially around awarding gaps and particularly around Black students. Okay, so before, I'd say, if people have any further questions, pop them in the chat for Daniela. Make sure you mark them as questions for Daniela. In the meantime, we will embark on our final presentation for today, and that would be, Aselia, sorry. Okay, Aselia, as we discussed at the start, you have 15 minutes, and I will give you a shout at about 13 minutes. But just to let you know, you've got 2 minutes remaining. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. So everybody can see my slides? Yes, can you hear me? All right. So this talk is going to take us a little bit into different directions. First of all, I must say I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. I think you know, this is one of my favorite crowds in our group, in our profession. So I'm psyched, very, very happy. The talk, I will take you in this conversation in a slightly different direction. First of all, it's not going to be heavily quant, you know, so I'm not going to be presenting a lot of stats. It will be more of an experiential presentation talking about what we did as a group of faculty and students in Atlanta and how we're actually hoping to expand in the future. But this is going to be a little bit more specific on the experiences and just sort of a descriptive view of what happened. Our group, the co-authors, includes 2 students, so Alex and Jacob, representing 2 different universities. We have 2 people who are representing the Federal Reserve Bank as representatives of basically the professional side or the professional networks. Jessica also was the president of Atlanta Economics Club, so she was helpful in terms of providing a lot of the connections and network opportunities. We have one person who is a former lawyer, but is an economist at heart, and he was sitting at a lot of the econ program boards. So he is very much familiar with what is going on in general in the profession. And of course, we have 3 faculty who are faculty advisors in 3 different schools. In terms of the representation of the schools, Georgia Tech is an R1 and Oglethorpe is a small private liberal arts school, and Georgia Gwinnett College is a public school. Both of those are a lot more diverse in terms of the student population. So I would be curious when we have a chance to chat in the questions to basically ask all of you if you have ever or are currently serving in any role as an advisor or a mentor to a student group for students who are taking economics or interested in economics. And if you are, then probably you will be interested in what I have to tell you here a little bit. The main purpose is that I just want to share some of the practices and lessons that we did. There is not really a lot of time to talk about the evolution of this heartfelt endeavor. I do want to mention that we developed a very strong group cohesion and ability to work with each other, developed strong friendships as a result of that, but I can't talk about it. I also won't be able to tell you the literature because there's just not enough time, but again, I'm more than happy to discuss some of those points later during the questions. So the Atlantic Economics Club, which is a chapter of the National Associations of the Business Economists, presented us with the ability to connect and create some synergies, putting together students from different economics clubs within the Atlanta area. And so we basically wanted, our goal was primarily to increase the awareness of what the major is like, what the profession is like, what's available for the students once they get the major and graduate. And so we had a very much shared mission, which I know a lot of you also have in your hearts, which is the broadening the pipeline, having more students from different backgrounds enter our profession. So it's educating and empowering economic students and professionals across Georgia with meaningful insights into economic trends and key issues. We faculty advisors obviously wanted to support not just our students, but also ourselves in our work, expand and enrich the activities within the econ clubs. So we all knew, we came with this knowledge or some hearsay and anecdotal evidence that suggested that extracurricular, co-curricular activities help attract students or may help attract students into the major. Anything that happens outside of the classroom would be a positive for the students. That was basically our prior. And of course, we very much wanted to include and ensure that the doors were wider or they were more open for the students with historically representative backgrounds. Some of the synergies that we wanted to explore together as an interinstitutional collaboration was basically use the Federal Reserve in Atlanta as well as the Atlanta Economics Club to access the professionals working in the field at different levels, as well as different types of companies, different types of jobs, different types of levels, different types of success. They also offered expertise in terms of organizing the events on a professional, level. In hosting those presentations and events. They also provided, obviously, the networking opportunities, which very quickly dried up during the first couple of semesters during COVID. We faculty advisors brought to the table the ability to connect to other faculty as well as students and also alumni from the previous programs. So this was a chance for us to actually maybe scale up our activities so that we could decrease some of our own time commitment and other costs. So the way that we are organized, we have the planning group, the primary planning group, where you have the Georgia Gwinnett College, Oglethorpe, and Georgia Tech, of course, each of which takes care of one event per semester. So, all in all, we have 2 events that every school has to sponsor, maybe 1 or 2 events, depending on the capacity, obviously, the students' planning capacity. And the Atlanta Economics Club obviously oversees a lot of this and provides the common ground for getting together and discussing those plans. And we are inviting all the other schools that are in our area, with a couple of those being the historically Black universities, and their students were able to participate as well. The types of the events ranged, usually we actually talked to students and did a few surveys with the topic, what it is that you want to learn about. And of course, our prior was that we need to make sure that our students know what kind of jobs they're getting once they graduate. And so some of the first and earlier topics were econ degrees. What are they good for? What kind of careers do we get when we graduate? And we also moved into the gatekeeping insights, talking about building the relationships with faculty in order to get good recommendations, building relationships with alumni, and also learning some of the tips and tricks that the recruiters may not necessarily mention or students don't learn until maybe a little bit later down the line. So those were the main topics during the first year of our operation. And these are the two events that actually attracted a lot of the attention and high participation on the part of the students. So one of the things that we also did was basically look at, what may have affected attendance. Is it the topic? Is it the time? Is it the, the mode? Is it the people that were there, or the way that we promoted events, etc. So these two events were highly successful and attracted a lot of attention and attendance from the students. In the second year, we pretty much did the same thing. So expanded a little bit more into entrepreneurship. That was a student-driven topic. And also talked again about the creating path in economics. We also started expanding our allyship, or the alliance with other folks in the area or in our field who want to increase the representation and diversity within the field. And again, September the 13th was one of those very successful and well-attended events. We did not collect the data on March 8th, which ended up to be one of the also more successful events. And I'll tell you for why we think that happened later on. And most notably, this last April, we had the capstone event that was hosted by the Federal Reserve, where we invited all the faculty as well as students to meet each other, mingle, talk to the president of Atlanta Fed and a couple of other senior researchers who talked about their path experiences and things that they have done to be where they are. So in terms of the attendance, we were able to collect some of the rudimentary data, who was there and how they attended, so which school they represented and whether they were in person or in virtual mode. The March and the April event, again, I didn't put the data on the slide, but we had about 80 people for March event and 200 people for April the 6th, which we were very happy about. So when we started looking at what it is that we actually did in terms of the promotion, as another sort of vector of how do we do that, what you're looking here is basically the school level marketing and tool channels, some of which actually are conducted by the Atlanta Economic Club, because they were sending some of those emails to give the gravitas sort of the communication and the promotion. And we have the 3 schools that have been doing most of the promoting, the students who have worked really hard to create the flyers and emails and posts and whatnot. And so some of these events efforts were consistently applied for all events. Some were not necessarily consistent. We sort of collected some of that information. And what you notice in terms of the types of the promotion, we had the flyers that were posted in classes, econ majors and minors. If minors are available, we also email those flyers to undeclared majors. Some idea to bring the extra credit or bring a friend extra credit was popular. We emailed faculty, we talked to them individually to try to help us increase the attendance. Obviously, the email list for the club, the group chat, social media, emailing the econ chairs and program directors, and the reminders to past participants to come back and chat with us. And so the events that tended to attract a lot of attention, those with the orange underline, actually offered this magic pill, which is basically extra credit. And Georgia Tech, we resisted doing this for some time until we basically gave up and decided to do it too. And so for those 2 events that were extremely successful, we did offer students the extra credit, and the extra credit was communicated to the professors. We collected the information, gave the list of the students. So we made sure that the instructor fixed costs were not high. So that was one of the things that we needed to make sure that happened. So main takeaways. The big wins is that the institutional alliance definitely helped decrease the cost, particularly for the faculty, but also for the students. So instead of doing 5 events per year by yourself or 6 events per year by yourself, you were in charge only of 1 or 2 events maybe, and then all you have to do is make sure that you show up to other events and send all the emails that are associated with that. But you don't have to do the entire event from start to end. The big wins for the students, very importantly, was that these conversations actually tended to be a little bit friendlier than what I've seen anecdotally, and some of us also discussed that. We were able to increase the types of topics and talk about some of the hard questions that maybe sometimes students don't want to ask when they're sitting only with a group of the same students or the same faculty. I think that there is this dynamic, if there is one faculty and all the students are discussing with like a professional, there could be this faculty could be having basically a deterring effect on the types of the questions that students want to ask. Maybe they don't want to out themselves as somebody who is aspiring to get into a PhD school, which actually happened in one of our cases. So students had a little bit more, they felt a little bit freer, less anxiety, and they had a little bit more fun. Some of the lessons is that we wish we took a little bit more time to think about an IRB protocol to collect the data and ask them a little bit more targeted and interesting questions. It became clear early on, I think after about the first year, that generic messaging, whether we were talking about undeclared majors or just well students, they do work, but not as well as the targeted outreach. So seeing a student who may be struggling, who may be having second thoughts, who is from a historically underrepresented background, and taking a minute and actually having a discussion and talking about what's your interest, what are you thinking about it, what do you want to do with your degree once you graduate, created more of the connectedness and rewarding experience for both for the students as well as the faculty. Some of the things that we want to do in the future is connect with the alumni who represent different groups and talk about their experiences, particularly the roadblocks and the difficult situations that they had to overcome as students as well as the professionals. Specifically, what kind of skills, maybe soft skills, the networking. We had a couple of instances when students felt really anxious. They were not comfortable doing the networking thing. The networking has a very negative connotation, or can have a negative connotation among students, particularly, and that's my observation from underrepresented groups. So those kind of skills and connections would probably make a lot of difference for our students. This targeted outreach and engagement did pay. So we ended up developing a second group at Georgia Tech here. So I'm going to just jump to that line. The OD at Georgia Tech decided to have a separate registered organization, and it was led primarily by women of color last year, which was for us a great achievement. We were very happy to see that. But again, that work came as a result of a lot of the individual mentoring, advisement, and most certainly outreach. So sitting passively in my office did not produce any results. Same for my colleagues. It's actually going out and talking to those students, taking time to engage them. So that was one of the bigger lessons that, and also victories that we have experienced. So in terms of the survey instrument, instead of the anonymous trial survey that we had, we would like to do an honest to God RB survey. We would like to use the RBG survey that was developed or adapted by Amanda Bayer and co-authors in her work in 2020, I believe. And some of the questions that they have, so adapting their questions within the framework of the extracurricular work would be, was this event collegial? People like me can be part of professional economics networks. This event made this profession relatable to my life.
Aselia, you just got to kind of...
I'm done, right? Is that what you're telling me?
Oh, perfect time.
Yeah. And I am done. So yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Amazing.
Here we go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Immaculate timekeeping. Apologies for my interruption right at the end. I was kind of holding out. I was like, I think you're done. I think you're done. Do you want to stop sharing the screen? Perfect. Thank you so much. Wow, that was an incredible amount of organization must have gone into that. So 3 outstanding presentations. I'm sure we can all sort of agree. So as I say, Romina's been recording some of the questions in the chat and passing these on to me. But I would just like to start off with a question for the whole panel, which was initially sort of asked of Sergio, but I think it's relevant in all cases, and that is, what role do you think the wider frame of where economics belongs, so whether it's a STEM and a quantitative or a sociology, social science, or a business and entrepreneurship, where do you think, or how do you think that distinction and how you frame economics impacts selling economics to different groups of students? Start off, I guess, with Sergio, then Daniela, or however you choose.
I think that's a good question. So I think it's probably important because the way that we frame, right, where economics belongs, whether it's STEM, whether it's sociology, or whether it's business, that highlights the types of attributes of the field that we're going to advertise, right? So if it's a STEM field, then we're going to advertise a lot of the quantitative skills. We're going to advertise, a lot of the rigor. If we market it as a kind of sociology, social science, then that means we could frame it more towards like understanding the human condition, how humans play in society, the role of economic decisions in human life, right? And if we talk about business, right, then we start thinking a little bit more practical about like, this is what economics can teach you. This is how it can help you in your business career. This is how it helps you maximize profits and minimize losses. And, these 3 framings of the field, I have a feeling attract very different types of students. And I honestly think it's an asset of the field that it's so broad that it can incorporate these 3 things. But in practice, it can be very clunky if we're focusing so much on one aspect. And I think another thing that could be important, right? So I've been to institutions where there was 2 economics majors. One was a business major and the other one was a social science major. It seemed like students that took the social science route versus the business route were completely different kinds of students. And at the same time, though, there was also this reputation for the social science route that also kind of sold it as, well, if you didn't get into the business school, here's a business-like degree that's technically social science that you can get into. And that kind of framing is not very positive or affirming. And, I think we have to be very careful. I'm not exactly sure, whether to take a stance where it should be marketed. I mean, my preference would probably be economics is great because it can do all these things. But I also understand that there's a choice at the end of the day where it has to fit.
Good. Does anybody else have anything to add?
I agree with Sergio completely. It depends on how we sell it. Within Queen Mary, we have a peculiar situation because we are a school of economics and finance, no? So we are not a business school. So very often at undergraduate level, we have students from a disadvantaged background who try to get into economics. They tend to be good at maths. And they come to us with the idea of getting a well-paid job after that. So this is obviously, I'm taking that to the extreme, but that's the idea. And there is a lot of quants versus non-quants. We've been discussing a lot about economics being one of the very few, or if the only social science for example, that has forgotten his own history, right? So history of economic thought is also taught in a certain way. So we tend to boost the quantitative skills and to support our students in that area. It does definitely attract different students, but I would move this question to a step forward and getting into the replication of economics as a profession. So who do we get from those students who join undergraduate to PhD students? And I don't know if this is a shared experience, but my experience is that PhD students nowadays hardly do any economics. They spend years coding in their room. And I think this is an emergency. I mean, it's getting to the point that, what will be economics in 10, 20 years' time is my main concern related to your question, Tim, really.
I agree with both panelists. So I think that it's important to, well, for me, I think for a while I was focusing primarily on the skills and the fact that our skills are applied through across different types of industries and at different levels, and all of that good stuff was kind of one of the most important selling points. But lately, I have been focusing attention on the problems and the issues that the generation of our students will be facing. And, I'm preaching to the choir, talking about, we have some critical issues that we have to solve as a society. And I also think that the fact that a lot of the issues are at the heart of this, what we call market failure, sort of, that discussion needs to be put back into the center of everything that evolves. And I'm not saying that, economists will solve all of the problems, but they definitely need to be included in a lot of those conversations within sustainable education and other such efforts. So making that connection between here is, the world that you are seeing outside, what it is that you want to do, how do you want to contribute, what kind of issues, problems do you want to solve for yourself? Do you want to make money? Do you want to make money so you could help somebody else? Do you want to change, the world in any way? And if you want, econ is actually a good, set of skills to have. And that seems to help attract students from, interestingly enough, I would say, and I don't have any evidence for that, but I tend to have conversations with students who want to go in finance, corporate law, or work in poverty and urban institute and places like that.
Cool, thank you, everybody. So Damien has made a question. It's a very common question that he's asked, and that is, to what extent do you think that universities can address the awarding gap that we observe? And does this achievement gap not actually start to grow from very early years? And by the time students reach university, it's quite difficult to make a substantial impact. So I guess the question is about how do you make an impact when in fact, a lot of these things are emerging before university, before the students even arrive. I guess, do you want to go in a reverse order this time, or whoever can jump in, or whoever wants to jump in?
This would be a thinking on the go for me. I really haven't thought a lot about this. So let me just restate your question that I understand this correctly. Is the question that, do we want to address the achievement gap even before students arrive to the university? Is that the question? And how do we want to do it?
I think it's more about the idea that achievement gaps, the roots of achievement gaps start much earlier. And how do you think it's possible, or how do you overcome these potential achievement gaps if you think they exist?
Well, I think that overcoming them is possible. I'm not sure overcoming them 100% or entirely or forever is possible. I think it's something that might have to be maintained throughout our practice. However, there are certain gains that other disciplines have attained, and they have been able to maintain for a few years. Again, notably, we are the worst in terms of the diversity and the achievement gaps within different groups. And so maybe following their example and trusting that people in cognitive science or physicists who adopted and adapted, I should say, and took on the tools and the rules from the cognitive science within pedagogy, following their suit and not thinking that we know better, a lot of times might be one way to go. In terms of the pipeline, I do think it's a matter of going back into the high schools and as early as possible and talking about them, the econ degrees. And I know that a few folks have done quite a bit of work on that. I haven't myself, so I'm going to let others respond.
I think it's possible, but it's more than possible. It's absolutely necessary. It's necessary, and it's necessary because otherwise we will keep on having a majority of white male within economics to start with, being in academia or as a practitioners. And this is part of the problem, isn't it? It's part of the ability of economics to address real issues. I mean, come on, how many people from Eton can address real issues, right? In a nutshell. So this is definitely one thing. The other thing is, and I can connect, Tim, if you allow me, to one of the questions for me, which I read. It's definitely the wording gap we are experiencing connected with international education, but not in the way one may think. So the majority of ethnic minority students that we have at Queen Mary are local students, while white students come mainly from Europe. Now, obviously, if I'm a German or an Italian or a Spanish family, and I'm sending my child to study in London, it's very likely that they are really good. Okay. So I wouldn't go too much into reading what educational system is better, whether, you know, some European countries or the UK, but there may be some issues with how maths is taught in high school. Now, because of the international dimension of our education, I find tackling the awarding gap courses before university particularly challenging. So it falls back on us. The majority is maths. There is some in writing skills. There is some in reading skills. So the wording gap is something that should be continuously monitored, because we know our students and we know that, you know, each cohort reads less than the previous. So there is, you know, understanding of what they text understanding and so comprehension and so forth. But I mean, we have in many universities, there is plenty of resources, additional supporting quantitative, not just techniques, but actual grasping of what those skills are for. I don't think they are an incredible amount of effort. And diversifying the assessment is another one. True, requires resources. But I can speak for Queen Mary. If we are the most inclusive university of its kind, and we are serious about that, then we ought to do that.
Sergio, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, so I mean, if I got this correct, right, the question is, what role does the university play in these underrepresented gaps in economics? And there was some talk about pre-university factors too. I've actually, so one of my co-authors on this project, Susan Sajati, she's education and engineering, that's her field. And we are actually kind of in the progress of thinking about this question a little bit more. And, you know, I do think the university is important, right? To a certain extent, like, we're very limited in what we can do in the classroom, right? We have we can try to design our syllabus in a way to make it more inclusive and to make it more helpful, but depending on the wider university environment to funnel the students into our classes. And so when it comes to the university, I think the admissions decision is very important, right? But also at the level of the department, the criteria that the department sets for what you need to be an economics student is also very important. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. So Virginia Tech, my institution, because of the pandemic, they got rid of the SATs, right? They waived the SAT as a requirement for enrolling in the university. And as a result of waiving the SAT, it looked like we started getting a more diverse group of students. But immediately you see across the college kind of a reaction against that within the different departments, that now we have a lot of underprepared students that are coming to the university. How are they going to succeed in our courses or in our majors, right? And, when you start thinking about it this way, you start thinking about what the majors could be doing now to funnel students into their seats, right? There's capacity constraints. You need to decide who gets in the major, who doesn't get in the major. And there's been really good work by Zach Bleemer, who showed that in the California system, the UC system, that if you start implementing GPA gaps into getting into your majors, then it leads to underrepresentation of students into STEM, right? And so I think this is the reason why in my talk, I talked a little bit more than just, using diverse examples and talking about, this asset-based learning approach, talking about these differences of skills that students have, because then we have to start thinking about, are we actually teaching students to be good at economics, or are we just trying to select for students that are already talented and funnel them up the pipeline, right? And we could do that in the classroom, but the departments do it, the university does it. And I think this is where it's tricky, and we have to think a little bit more about, can we be more effective as instructors, or are we just funneling people who are most able to get there, right? And I think, and it's a very hard problem to solve. And I don't think it's necessarily easy. Like I'll give you an example of some other work that we've looked at. We've looked at the role of remedial coursework, right? Intuitively, it makes sense that if you have students who have less math preparation, if you give them remedial coursework, they'll be able to succeed in the course. But if you look at a lot of the literature on remedial coursework, it kind of looks like, especially students on the margin, it is more of a hindrance than an aid, right? And so then you have to start thinking about the rigidity of the majors, how much flexibility do students have, and are you just creating more obstacles in the way of students who might be slightly less prepared in succeeding? So, I mean, I don't really offer any solutions. I just think it's a very hard problem, but it is important.
Thanks, Sergio. Yeah, I mean, if I could, this idea about, how early do awarding gaps emerge? It's a question I've heard raised in a number of conferences and a number of kind of fora about these things. But I mean, ultimately, my view, and I think is that shared by the panel, is that it's part of the university's responsibility. You can't, in effect, sort of just blame the idea that they already existed. But Sergio, there was a question here from Cloda for you, which I think links into the last question, but also what you were talking about in terms of assets. And the idea is, do you think we have an overly narrow view of what assets are valuable for studying economics when we select students for entry into the course, such that we're not even giving some people a chance who might have a more diverse set of assets? And how do you think the criteria for entry should be adapted to allow for a broader mix of human assets?
Yeah, so I think my answer would be yes. I think we focus too much on quantitative skills. But on the other hand too, right, the quantitative aspect of the field is just it's just an aspect of the reality of the field today, right? So I think it's going to be very hard to be successful as an economist if you don't develop those quantitative skills, right? But I think the exclusive focus on quantitative skills, I think that's kind of a wrong approach. And I'll just give you some anecdote, right? Like, I was like a philosophy minor when I was an undergrad. I really liked philosophy. And I think one of the classes that really kind of set me on the path to economics was a macroeconomics course. But because it was offered in the summer, my professor didn't focus too much on the quantitative models. He focused on the history of economic thought. And coming as a philosophy minor, that like, I really liked that. I really liked hearing what the difference was between the neoclassical guys, John Maynard Keynes, F.A. Hayek, you know, like how they all viewed these like underlying assumptions, right? And I still felt like I learned something about macroeconomics because it was presented more in a sense of like, these are the assumptions these guys are working with. Let's play it out and see what the implications of it are, right? And I think even when I was in graduate school, you know, my way of preparing for economics was I took as much abstract math as I could. And I actually think that was kind of a hindrance because I struggled a lot in trying to develop a practical approach to mathematics and tying the mathematics to concepts. And so I think, right, quantitative skills are important, but again, right, if we think about this like asset-based learning approach, where we think of other skills as being complementary, then other skills, like skills that would be useful in philosophy, like deductive logic, and not even like using math, just thinking of premises and following them down, like that can be helpful in helping students pick up the math, right? Like if you're making these connections between the math and other types of reasoning or other types of skill or putting together all these other things, I think it could actually make people better at the quantitative skills. So that's why I think, right, to a certain extent, you have to know some math, but you can use your other skills to help you understand the concepts better. And it might even just help you understand the math better too.
Excellent, thank you. So if I could just, unless anyone else would like to jump in there, I have a question for Aselia about, which kind of links to something that Sergio talked about in his talk, when he talks about identity and recognizing yourself in professional economists. And really it's a question about what was the thought process around the speakers and that were invited to the talks? This is a question for Aselia. What was the thought process behind the speakers, and how did different speakers resonate with different students from the different universities? Because you mentioned that there are sort of different types of universities within this kind of consortium that takes part.
Right. So I went into this effort with a very much determined mindset that I did not want to focus on the the celebrities of our field. I think one of my own experiences dictated that it's a good idea to meet with people who are still sort of grinding and working through and trying to figure out a lot of things on their own. I would have enjoyed and have learned a lot myself at that point in time when I was a student. So one of the things that we actually did encode in our entire programming from day one is that we didn't want to just pick the stars who just seemed perfect on their CVs or their papers, and in fact find as many people as possible sort of in that middle and starting echelon, whether we're talking about academic careers or professional careers. And with people from the Federal Reserve, we made a concerted effort to look for women economists, for underrepresented minority economists, and so as well as the alumni. So a couple of our alumni panels were focused on LGBTQIA specifically, so that was I believe that was a good thing to do. You know, it basically helped us create those very important and safe conversations at the same time, so students could actually relate to the experience of the many alumni that you know, the alumni were happy to talk about. And alumni are more than anybody else, I think, among the stakeholders who are coming with completely open hearts and willing to talk about their good and bad sort of experiences and share as much as possible. So that was part of it. I think I had a couple of questions there that dealt with some of that. Like, you know, if you're inviting somebody from finance who are extremely successful, do you think it actually is, you know, students will be able to identify with them? Well, we didn't do that. We specifically did not invite people who were, you know, kind of like a traditional representation, you know, of success in economics. So that was, you know, one of the questions. In terms of the, like, relating to the identity, I think it is very important to stress that part, identity building. So I think some of the stuff that we sort of haven't, or I haven't seen personally, is you know, the literature that does talk about the values and professional identity or professional integrity that students have to develop sooner or later, and our curriculum doesn't necessarily provide that. Although we have a lot of room for that, because a lot of the discussions and the policy debates do beg for value judgments. So even some of those, you know, philosophical, I think, debates are very important at this point. And I think that that ties into this, you know, identity building, professional identity building very well.
Excellent, thank you. So I guess for something I would like to ask for all speakers is thinking about the stuff that you've presented. So Sergio presented ideas for boosting these ideas of asset diversification, if you like, and boosting identity. And Daniela talked about these awarding gaps, and obviously we've got this kind of consortium. And really, I'd like to know at this point, like, what evidence would you like to have coming from these projects? So Daniela has quantitative, but, you know, what impact would, for example, qualitative evidence have on that? Sergio, what evidence do you have from these approaches that you're talking about? And Aselia, what evidence what's the outcome of all this, these meetings that you've had? I guess, Aselia, you go first, and then we'll work backwards.
Yes, for sure. So we do have collected a little bit of testimonial evidence from the students as well as the participants, as you know, the planners. I guess I'll start, you know, focused on myself. I felt like I built a community of like-minded folks who did not mind meeting at least once a month to talk about the planning, the events, you know, the details, some of the interesting stuff. We met before and after the event, making sure that we actually, you know, touched on every potential issue or an issue that did arise during the conversation. We faced some of the interesting criticisms in terms of, like, your panel is not necessarily, you know, the people who are actually planning are not necessarily super diverse, and we take it to heart, but it's not for the lack of effort. So we continue to work on that. I think it's super important. And within the students, you know, seeing students actually open up about their aspirations. You know, I do have a couple of examples in mind where people just, or the students did not want to tell that they actually wanted to pursue a degree in economics, a PhD degree in economics. So it was after a few events of the sort that they finally felt safe opening it up about it. I think there is a psychological barrier. Like, if I'm the only person who looks like this, you know, in this group, and I'm going to say that I actually want to be one of the best, like I'm competing for the top spot in this class, I think it's really intimidating and scary for them. And so creating those spaces was one of the most rewarding experiences. And we developed a few relationships with our students are going. They're openly pursuing PhD in economics now. And I think that having that, the second club that is led primarily by women of color students or women students of color is a big testament to all of that work. I also will say that I think it's important that we don't disregard qualitative research. particularly when we're dealing with some of the stuff that we're not willing to measure historically, or we don't know how to measure. I think that some of these topics and issues and experiences have to include the qualitative and phenomenological research or anthropological research, however, or sociological types of studies. And I think that we are doing ourselves a big, we're not really doing ourselves any favors by focusing solely on very, either quant only, or if it's a descriptive, it's fairly shallow descriptive analyses. I think that we will gain a lot by doing comprehensive qualitative studies.
Cool. Daniela, do you want to jump in? And because I think you're, given that you're working with quants, what's your view on the qualitative side of things? We've got about 3 minutes left, so let's.
Thank you, Tim. I was actually, can I tie this question to a question that Parama was asking as well? We are running this study, which is mainly quantitative, mainly to convince economists within our department that wording gaps do exist. And there are some models which are responsible for the wording gaps dramatically more than other models. Okay, so it's a kind of consciousness, awareness exercise for us. And some colleagues understand quantitative more than qualitative studies, if you like, as a convincing arguments. So that was the rationale for us to start with this. In parallel, we are running, and we have another British Academy thing going on about perceived value added, where we are running some interviews and some focus groups, where we're going to discuss more about qualitative aspects. And one of these aspects will include, questions that will help us, will support us in understanding why we have so few Black students. I mean, I'm running an outreach event to Discover Economics, and I couldn't find any role model, right? So, this. So we are working on that. And the aim in a couple of years' time will be to have a composite picture, both quantitative and qualitative, that supports our decisions.
That's sorry, we're just going to have to wrap this up. I'm getting chats to say that basically I need to close this session down. So I'm going to have to interrupt you, Daniela. And sorry, Sergio, we're not going to get around to you on this question. But anyway, everybody, apologies to cut this discussion short, but there is another session that's starting around about now. So if everybody could show their appreciation for our three presenters today, they've done an amazing job. I found all three talks absolutely fascinating, and it's been a really stimulating discussion afterwards. Remember, there is a social mixer in 90 minutes, which you should all have the link for. In the meantime, thank you, everybody. Hopefully we've all learned something today, and you've all contributed towards being a really, really enjoyable session to chair. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for chairing.
Thanks.